It's a great privilege to introduce Kai Bird and to have him here at the Bangalore International Center. Kai has had what I might describe as a varied and storied career. He's an American who grew up in part in India and Palestine. He graduated from the Cody International School. So he grew up in part in India and Palestine, and who, after his college education at Carleton College, was a roving journalist for about a decade, before commencing a series of fascinating and successful experiments with the art of biography. Relatively late in life, he became institutionalized as the director of the Leon Levi Center for Biography at the University of New York, where for almost 20 years now, he's run an extraordinary program of nurturing biographies by other people. I'll talk a little bit about Kai's own work, but through his directorship of the Leon Levi Center, which awards, I believe, 5 or 6 fellowships every year, year-long fellowships for people working on biographical monographs on different themes. He's nurtured, mentored 40-odd writers and scholars, among them someone who has a connection with our city and our country, Saman Subramanian, whose biography of J.B.S. Haldane was completed and written while he was a fellow at the center that Kai runs in New York. Now, biography is at least insofar as non-fiction writing goes, it's the most challenging of literary forms. And I've spoken about that at this venue too in the past, and I won't go over that, but you will have to take my word for it, that compared to writing works of social or political history or travel or indeed memoir, and certainly compared to writing works of economics, it's the most challenging of literary forms. And here we have in Kai Bird a master biographer who's written more than half a dozen major biographies, all highly acclaimed and which have won many prestigious awards. And of course, none more so than the book he's going to talk about today, his biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which he co-authored with Martin Shewin. Now, in reading that biography afresh for today's talk, because when Kai wrote it, and when I first came across it, I did not know Kai. I mean, I've got to know him over the last few years. It struck me that in many ways, even if Kai did not major in physics, Kai, I don't know what your major was, even if he did not major in physics, I won't ask you, the biographer and his subject are very well matched. Because Kai has spent his personal and professional life crossing boundaries. I said a little bit in my introduction about him. He's crossed professional boundaries, geographical boundaries, literary boundaries. And Oppenheimer was a boundary crosser supreme, between the East Coast and the West Coast, with New Mexico thrown in, between America and Europe, with an extended stint in Cambridge, in England, between science and politics, between government and academics, between theory and application, between physics, philosophy, literature, music, and ranching. So he was a real Renaissance figure. And Kai, of course, does justice to all those aspects of his life, work, impact, legacy in the book that he authored with Shewin. Now, this biography of Oppenheimer is notable for, among other things, the depth of its research, which includes trawling through reams and reams of private papers, not just Oppenheimer's, but of other people too, state records, including intelligence files declassified from the FBI, scientific documents, newspapers, detailed interviews. So the depth and diversity of the sources on which it's based is truly impressive. It's also notable for the range of the characters, and a really good biography is sometimes notable not as much as what it says about the main character, as how it illuminates the secondary characters around the main character. So in this case, Oppenheimer's friends, rivals, lovers, wife, kids, enemies, persecutors, and so on. And finally, of course, the book is striking for the elegance of its writing. Now, Kai will tell us much more about the book in his talk. But I want to say that the first book of Kai I read was about himself. It was a childhood memoir called Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, which was about his life with his family in Palestine in the 50s and 60s. And I hope Kai one day, his most recent book, by the way, is a biography of Jimmy Carter, that great and greatly underrated American president. Maybe one day you'll write a memoir of your journey as a biographer, possibly titled My Life with Oppenheimer and Lesser Beings. Before I hand over the mic to Kai, there were just a couple of remarks beyond biography writing and into the domain of politics. There are two, among the many striking quotes in your book, emanating either from Oppenheimer or from others. There are two that are resonant with the world today, and particularly with the rise of jingoism and xenophobia. And I've often reflected on this, what I see as two children of nationalism, patriotism and jingoism, which are actually quite different. And Oppenheimer was a patriot, though of course he was labeled an anti-national. And there are two remarks I'll just quote before I end. One is Oppenheimer telling his great friend and colleague George Kennan, who was his colleague at the Institute of Advanced Studies and himself the subject of very large and impressive biographies by scholars. He was a diplomat and strategic thinker. And in the 50s, when Oppenheimer was being persecuted by the McCarthyist hysteria that was then prevalent in America, and he was getting offers of, he could have taught anywhere in Europe because of his great scholarship. He could just move. And Kennan asked him, why don't you move? And Oppenheimer said, because I love this goddamn country. But that's one remark. The other remark comes much later in the book, and it's about Einstein. Einstein telling someone about Oppenheimer. Einstein was, of course, the preeminent figure at the Institute of Advanced Studies when Oppenheimer was the director. And Oppenheimer is telling someone that the problem with Oppenheimer, that he's in love with a woman who does not love him back. And that's the United States government. Kai.
Well, namaste. Thank you very much for having me. This is a real honor to be back in Bangalore. I think the last time I was here was in 1969. I was graduating from Kodaikanal School up in the Palni Hills, and we had a field trip to Bangalore. It was like we were let out of prison. But I loved Kodi. I loved spending a few years in India, and I came back, indeed, as Ram has said, as a journalist, and traveled with my wife Susan all over Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and also Nepal. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be back. I'm going to talk a little bit, about my journey as a biographer, and also I know you're all interested in the film. So how many of you have seen the film? Oh, wow. I don't think I need to talk at all. The story has been, you know the story. Right? Well, listen, Ram is right that biography is the most arduous scholarship ever. And I don't say that lightly. I sort of stumbled into it as a journalist. I spent 10 years working at various magazines in America and abroad, and then decided it was time for me to write a book. And I chose a subject, and I thought it would take me 2.5 years. And 10 years later, 10 years later, the book finally came out. My wife thought it would never happen. I had gotten biographer's disease, which is sort of when you are so obsessive and so interested in your subject, there's always one more archive or one more interview that should be done and before you can start to write. Anyway, I did a biography of John J. McCloy, a powerful Wall Street lawyer, and then a biography of McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor for both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. And both of these men, interestingly enough, were friends of Oppenheimer. So I had to write about them, about Oppenheimer, in a little bit in the course of writing those two biographies. And at the time, I had gotten to know Martin Shewin, who was a wonderful historian at Tufts University. And he had signed a contract with Knopf, Alfred Knopf Publishers in New York, in 1980. And he started to get to work and did just a tremendous amount of research. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request and got the FBI file released, 8,000 pages of documents. He interviewed 150 people and neatly transcribed all these interviews. Eventually, he gathered like 50,000 pages of documents, letters, diaries. In about 1999, after my Bundy book came out, Marty came to me and said, "I know you're unemployed." And indeed I was, and Susan was trying to persuade me to actually get a real job, something with a salary. And I actually found a real job for 1 semester teaching at American University history. And I hated it. It left me no time to write or think. I was very nervous in front of all these young students who were not interested in doing the readings at all. So it was a bad experience, my only encounter with academia. Anyway, Marty came to me and said, "Well, I'm kind of stuck with Oppenheimer and I need help. Why don't you join me on this project?" And I turned to Marty and I said, I like you too much, Marty, to do that. I feared that co-authorship would lead to enmity and troubles. But he was very persistent and kept coming back down from Boston to Washington, D.C., where we were living at the time. And he knew he had to convince Susan to give me permission to do this. And eventually, she was sort of won over, and he came to me and he says, if you don't do this, my gravestone is going to read, "He took it with him." There were other academics who were poking about at the subject. Everyone knew that Oppenheimer was a fabulous biographical subject, a really iconic figure, very important. For all sorts of reasons. And they also knew that Marty was working on it, so they backed off anyone who was. But after 20 years, there were rumors that other historians were about to weigh in on the subject. Anyway, I joined Marty, and it turned into a fabulous collaboration. But it still took 5 years to write and publish the book, so it was a total of 25 years. And Oppenheimer is, I should just say a few words about him. He's, as you can see from the film, he's very intense, very intelligent, conflicted about all sorts of things, curious about not only quantum physics, but the poems of T.S. Eliot and John Donne, and indeed, yes, he learned Sanskrit so that he could read the Gita in the original. And yet there was something, in his personality that was a mystery to both Marty and I. He was always kind of psychologically fragile. As a young man, he did indeed have a psychological nervous breakdown of some sort that is portrayed in the movie as the poison apple incident. And there are other mysteries. His politics. He was apolitical when he first arrived in Berkeley, but then the Depression hit, and capitalism seemed to be failing, and he met a young woman named Jean Tatlock, who was studying to become a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and she was a member of the Communist Party, and she nagged Oppie to be more politically aware. But there's still nevertheless a mystery about whether he was just pink or actually red, whether he actually also joined the party. And Marty and I sort of debated this issue amongst ourselves, but in the book you see us debating it, showing you the evidence. And J. Edgar Hoover, the secret police chief in America that ran the FBI, was tracking Oppenheimer since 1940, trying to prove that he was a red, a full-blown member of the Communist Party. And there's no smoking gun in the documents to prove that. So we concluded that he was actually pink, but very active and giving a lot of money to party causes. He also, had, at one point in the book, we make a point of saying that he turned to Frank, his younger brother, at one point and said, I would be a happy man if I could find some way to combine my passion for New Mexico and my passion for quantum physics. And indeed, as a young man of 18, he had been sent out by his family to New Mexico to a dude ranch, and he fell in love with horseback riding. He was a scrawny sort of New York City boy who was not very athletic, but he fell in love with horseback riding and the landscape of New Mexico. And of course, he did find a way to combine his passion for New Mexico and physics, and it was in a place called Los Alamos. So I'm not going to talk about what he achieved at Los Alamos. He is very ambivalent about that achievement. He always said that there was, you cannot expect human beings to stop science. They are too curious about the physical world around them, and they're going to discover the science. So quantum was discovered in the 1920s, and it led to the discovery of fission in 1939 by two German scientists. And Oppenheimer knew that this was going to happen, and as soon as he learned that fission had experimentally been achieved, he, within an hour, ran to the blackboard and did some calculations and proved that there could be, in fact, a big bomb coming out of this. So his motivation for working on this was patriotic. He was a patriot. It was singed with ambition as well. But he knew, his real motivation was that he knew that the German scientists that he had studied with in Germany in the 1920s, he had attended lectures by Werner Heisenberg, and we knew by 1942 that Heisenberg was leading the German bomb project. So he knew they were just as capable as he was, and probably they were ahead in this race to build this terrible gadget. So that was his motivation. But he was extremely complicated too, in that, he was aware of the tragedy that he was becoming a part of. And one day I managed to discover that his last secretary, Ann Wilson, was still alive, living just 2 miles away down the road from where I lived in Washington, D.C. And I sought out Ann and had a terrific interview. And in the course of the interview, at one point, she told me that one day she was walking to work with Robert, as she called him, and he suddenly started muttering, "Those poor little people, those poor little people." And she stopped him and said, "Robert, what are you talking about?" Well, he said, the Trinity test has been successful. This is in late July. We know it works now, the gadget, and now it's going to be used on Japanese cities because there's no other target big enough. And so he was worrying about those poor little people who were all going to be victims, women and children and old men and very few soldiers. Hiroshima had an army camp at the outskirts of the city, but it wasn't chosen, it wasn't targeted for the army encampment. Anyway, I told Marty Shewin, I told him later that day what I'd learned from this very evocative story from Ann Wilson. And he says, well, that's very curious. Marty knew the material so well because he'd spent 20 years with it, and he says, that's curious because that must be the same week that he was meeting with the bombardiers that were going to be on the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb. And he was instructing them at exactly what altitude the bomb should be released from the plane and at what altitude it should be ignited to have the maximum destructive impact. And by the way, that it should be dropped in clear weather, no fog, no clouds, and that they should select the bridge right in the center of Hiroshima, again, to kill the most people. So this is a complicated man. He is like Arjun in the Gita, he is doing his duty for his country and building this terrible weapon, and he's worrying terribly about the consequences. So the book wrestles with all of these stories. Now, I know I need to get along to the film. So why is this story so powerful today? Why has it resonated across the globe? I was in Jaipur this last few days at the festival, and I was at times mobbed by these high school students who had all, they'd all seen the film, and some of them had actually read the book too. And of course, this, 3 years ago, no one of that sort would have known who Oppenheimer was, and yet the film resonates in a powerful way. And I'd say that it does so for three reasons. Suddenly people are realizing 75 plus years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki that we are still living with this bomb, this evil thing, as Oppenheimer called it. And it hasn't been used since Nagasaki, but the story's not over. And 75 years is a drop in the ocean of time. And Oppenheimer was desperate after the war to explain that we need to do something to control this technology. And, so I think young people in particular are coming to this story, understanding that their parents have been far too complacent about living with the bomb. Secondly, the story, tells a dramatic story about American politics. And unfortunately, like it or not, America is this hovering presence in the our global civilization. It influences us in so many ways. And I think most foreigners and also most Americans don't understand the roots of our politics today. And it is in McCarthyism. And Robert Oppenheimer became the chief celebrity victim of the McCarthy era. I remember Marty telling me at one point when we were writing the book in about 2003, he says, Kai, you and I wouldn't be spending all these years writing this book about this quantum physicist if it was just a story about the making of the atomic bomb. What gives it an arc, what gives it a curiosity, a compelling story, is the fact that he was destroyed 9 years after he was celebrated. In 1945, his image was put on the cover of Time and Life, and 9 years later, he was tried in a secret kangaroo court and humiliated and stripped of his security clearance. And then they leaked the transcript to the New York Times, suggesting that Americans would read in this transcript all the evidence they needed to be persuaded that he was disloyal, not a patriot, and maybe a spy. He was destroyed. He was humiliated. And that's an important story to understand because it explains our divisive politics in America today. It explains Donald Trump. Seriously. So my evidence for saying this is that is very simple. Roy Cohn was the chief counsel to Senator Joe McCarthy and was trying to investigate Oppenheimer when he was diverted by the Eisenhower administration and told, oh, we've got other plans for Oppenheimer in this secret trial. Anyway, Roy Cohn is responsible for sort of corrupting our the American political scene in the 1950s. And then he goes on to be chief counsel to all 5 mob families in New York City in the 60s and 70s. And in 1973, he's sitting at Club 21, a sort of dinner club in Manhattan. And at the next table is a young real estate developer named Donald Trump. And they become good buddies. Roy becomes Trump's lawyer. And he teaches him everything Roy knows about how to deal with the press, how to always countersue, how to tell the big lie, how to never pay your taxes. It's like incredible. He's just a rogue character who gave the Donald Trump that we see today. It's an incredible story. Finally, that's 1 and 2. Finally, the story resonates because of Oppenheimer as a scientist. And we are now on the verge of AI, another scientific revolution. And we need scientists to explain the choices we face, how to regulate this new technology. And Sam Altman, one of the founders of AI, has been going around recently saying, yes, this is another Oppenheimer moment. You know, Oppenheimer wanted us to pay attention to scientists and their advice. Well, unfortunately, because of what happened to him in the McCarthy period, that sent a message to all scientists not to get out of your narrow lane of expertise. Don't pretend to be a public intellectual. Don't talk about politics or policy because they could come after you and destroy you. And I think that as a consequence of that, we have very few public intellectuals who are full-blown scientists. And that's incredible since we're in a globe just drenched with technology and science. And anyway, it's, so the film, you know, the book came out, do I have a few more minutes? You know, the book came out in 2005. And even before it won the Pulitzer, it was optioned for film by a major Hollywood director. And they did a script. And Marty and I were quite excited. We thought, wow, this is unusual. 720-page book. And 4 years went by. They wrote a script. They eventually showed it to us. It was really boring. And they gave up. And another party came along and picked up the film option. And another 4 years rolled by, and they wrote a pretty decent script. But they couldn't interest the studios. The response I was told was, oh, this is, you know, too much history, too complicated, too controversial. And who's ever heard of Oppenheimer? So they gave up after 4 years. And then a young, middle-aged businessman in New York who had gone to MIT and gotten a master's degree in physics, and had a sort of private hobby passion for the Manhattan Project. He just loved reading about it, and he picked up the option. Dave Wargo was his name. And but he didn't really ever introduce himself to us, Marty and I. He just said he was going to do it, and they did get a script written, and we were finally shown it, and it was so awful that Marty and I spent several days writing a long memo listing the 108 historical inaccuracies in the script. At one point in the script, they had a ghost reciting poetry. They had a scene in which Oppenheimer hallucinates that he's dropping a cyanide tablet into Edward Teller's drink at a Berkeley cocktail party, and he sees Teller dying on the floor in front of him. And we protested, no, Oppie never would have killed Edward Teller. Anyway, it was a disaster, and we thought, Hollywood can't grapple with this. So it was, Marty and I had given up hope. And then suddenly in September 21, a friend read a little paragraph item in Variety, this Hollywood gossip sheet, saying that Christopher Nolan's next film is going to be about Robert Oppenheimer. And we wondered, oh, well, is it going to be based on our book or some other source? And we had our agent inquire, and suddenly I got a phone call, and I was told that Nolan wanted to talk to me. And we had a chat a few days later, and then a meeting up in New York. And he's not like any other Hollywood director. There's no snazz to him. There's no embellishments. He's very down to earth and intelligent in a quite intimidating, quiet fashion. You know what I mean? And we sat there for 2.5 hours. He's half British, so he was sipping one cup of tea after another. And he wasn't ready to share with us the script. He said it was very long. He was still working on it. But we asked him a series of questions. He said he'd answer any questions. And I had taken Susan along to this meeting, and I had told her, now, please, this is a business meeting, so please don't, talk too much. Knowing that Susan would, if she found an opportunity, would jump in and ask a lot of tough questions. And she did. I started it out with a sort of lighthearted question. I asked Nolan if he had in the script Oppenheimer's favorite toast for his powerful gin martinis. And the toast is, "To the confusion of our enemies." And Nolan laughed and said, yes, it was in the script, but the other day I had to cut it for space. So I thought that was a good sign. He was paying attention to the details. And he explained that he had read the book in March of 2021 and sat down and wrote the screenplay over the next 5 months and had something approaching 200 pages by September. And Susan asked all sorts of questions about what was in the film and what was not at this point. And we came away impressed that maybe, something would happen. And I reported back to Marty, who, alas, tragically was so ill with small cell lung cancer that he wasn't able to travel up to New York for that meeting. But I reported to him that I was optimistic that maybe something finally was going to happen. And sadly, he died 2 weeks later. So he never got a chance to meet personally with Nolan. But he died knowing that maybe the film was going to be made. I think, I'm sure people are going to ask me what I think of the film. I'll tell you the following story. When I finally saw it, he did share with me the screenplay and just before he started filming, and he he accepted two of my suggestions. But it was not a screenplay that I thought needed a lot of work. I thought it was incredibly inclusive of the high points of Oppenheimer's story and very moving. But I'm not a screenwriter, and it really took me to see the film to understand the power of what he had done in transforming this book into a film. And I saw it in mid-May. He flew me out to Los Angeles, and the next morning at 10 a.m., he walked me into an empty IMAX theater and sat me right in the middle, his favorite seat, he said. And then he graciously adjourned to the end of the aisle, like 30 seats away, and to give me privacy to watch this show in alone. And I was incredibly moved. It brought me to tears at times, thinking partly what would Marty Shewin think of this scene or that. And it conveys, both Oppenheimer's personality and life story, his politics, his love life, but also the lessons of his life, the lessons of a scientist as a public intellectual, the lessons of living with the atomic bomb. So on that note, I want to try to give you a sense of Oppenheimer's personality that you haven't seen, even in the film. And that might explain why Marty and I had this obsession to work on this for, in Marty's case, 25 years. And this is a brief little 2-minute excerpt from a speech he gave on November 16th, 1945. And I think it captures his personality, his charisma, the soft-spoken tone of his voice. And he's speaking as a philosopher, not a quantum scientist. But let's see if we can make this work.
These are contingent things. What is not contingent is that we have made a thing a most terrible weapon. It's altered abruptly and profoundly the nature of the world. We've made a thing that by all the standards of the world we grew up in is an evil thing. By so doing,
There's a pause.
by our participation in making it possible to make these things, we have raised again the question of whether science is good for man, whether it is good to learn about the world, try to understand it, try to control it, to help give to the world of men increased insight, increased power. Because we are scientists, we must say an unalterable yes to these questions. It is our faith, our commitment, seldom made explicit, even more seldom challenged, that knowledge is a good in itself. Knowledge and such power as must come with it. One will perhaps think back to the early days of physical science in Western culture, when it was felt as so deep a threat to the whole Christian world. One will remember the more recent times of the last century, where such a threat was seen by some in the new understanding of the relations between man and the rest of the living world. One may even remember the concern among the learned at some of the fundamental developments of physics, the theory of relativity, and even more, the ideas of complementarity, and their far-reaching implications on the relations of common sense and scientific discovery. Their enforced reminder, familiar to Hindu culture, but rather foreign to that of Europe, of the latent inadequacies of human conceptions to the real world described. One may think of these things, and especially of the great conflicts of the Renaissance, because they reflect the truth that science is a part of the world of men, that often before it has injected into that world elements of instability and change, that if there is peril in the situation today, as I believe there is, we may look to the past for reassurance that our faith in the value of knowledge will prevail.
Okay.
The atomic bomb is not...
I played that little excerpt in part for this audience because he talks about the influence of Hindu mysticism on him. And this was a serious thing. He really read the Gita. And he thought it explained the world of the quantum in the way that Western religions had not. Anyway, on that note, I will subject myself to an interrogation.
Is it on? No. Yeah, come, Kai. Thank you, Kai. Can we have the lights on? Little brighter if possible. Yeah, thank you. Uh, 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 that was a wonderful talk, and vivid and rich and wide-ranging. Uh, uh, the floor is open for questions. Who's going to ask the first question? You put up your hands. I'll direct it. Someone, yeah, you here. I mean, if the mic will come here. Yeah, mic will come. So you just put up your hands and yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. Actually, my question is, how is there any specific reason why Heisenberg failed to develop the weapon?
I'm sorry, was Heisenberg paid to
Failed to develop.
Why did he fail?
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's a terrific question because historians, even today, there's an argument, a debate among them about whether he failed by making a simple mathematical error calculating the amount of enriched uranium that would be necessary for a bomb, or he failed because he was actually sabotaging the project.
Yeah.
This is brought out most famously some years ago in the play by Michael Frayn called Copenhagen, which is all about a conversation between Heisenberg and Niels Bohr. And I think it's a mystery. And there's a great book, a biography of Heisenberg by a good biographer, Tom Powers. And he argues that he's convinced that Heisenberg was too smart to make that simple mathematical error.
Yeah. That's a wonderful play, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. So earlier you mentioned that there was some characteristic of Oppenheimer that you and Marty were just not able to crack. And earlier you said that during a speech. Were you able to crack it? What was that characteristic about Oppenheimer?
The mystery of
Oppenheimer.
Well, you know, he's complicated in the psychologically in that, you know, he's raised in very well-off circumstances in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. He's pampered. He's clearly, if not a child genius, he has a overarching influence very young in chemistry and science, and he goes off to Harvard and finishes in 3 years, and then he goes to Cambridge, England, to study experimental physics. And for the first time in his life, he fails, and he fails in a big way. I mean, he's awkward with his hands. He breaks things, and something happened. And this is a mystery story, but we know that something happened to cause the Cambridge authorities to suspend him or put him on probation. And his parents came and assured the authorities that he would be taken to a psychiatrist and for a few sessions. And we know this happened. He went to a Harley Street psychiatrist and then to a French psychiatrist. Interestingly enough, the French, none of this is in the movie, but the poison apple is there too. I think, you know, the movie doesn't address his childhood, but it's there, and I'm glad it's there, the poison apple, because it humanizes Oppenheimer as a young man who's struggling. And anyway, the French psychiatrist in Paris had a few sessions with the young Oppenheimer and told his parents that he would advise red wine and the professional services of a professional woman.
You know, for those of you who've seen the movie and not read the book, please do so, because the movie is very good, but there's much, much more in the book. And one of the, uh, as I said, alluded to in my introductory remarks, one of the real strengths of the book is the other characters around him. And they're very intriguing characters, and some are really well known, like Keller, for example, or General Graves, and so on. And of course, Hoover. But one of the really fascinating characters in that is his brother, Frank Oppenheimer,
Yes.
who was almost certainly a more committed communist, a very gifted physicist too, and had a very troubled and traumatic life. And is there a biography of him? Someone may be prompted by your work to write a book on him, because I think he's worth it. He's a fascinating man.
He is. Actually, later in his life, he did suffer he was fired at the University of Minnesota because of his Communist Party membership in the 30s. And he couldn't get a job. So he moved to Colorado and became a cattle rancher. And then the years went by, and he finally was able to get a job teaching in high school. And finally, in the 60s, he worked very hard to create the Exploratorium, the first science
San
museum
Francisco, you talk about
in
it.
San Francisco.
Yeah.
And it's a fabulous museum that is hands-on, allows kids to do experiments, and it teaches them the scientific process. So this was his passion at the end of his life.
So I hope someone writes a book called The Other Oppenheimer. Because I think it's inspired by your work. I think this is one of the things that a biography does, is to inspire other
That's true.
biographers too. There's at the back there. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll come to you at the back.
So in a post-truth world that we live today, and the rise of false narratives, chat GPT, what are your thoughts on this new McCarthyism? How is it going to influence human individual liberty? The second question I have is,
One question,
yeah,
please.
Well, Chat GPT. I'm actually, a few weeks ago, I and several other biographers signed on to a class action suit where we're suing Microsoft because Microsoft took and scanned all our biographies so that they could use them to teach ChatGPT how to think, how to write. And they didn't ask our permission. So I think this is an invasion of the copyright laws. And, artificial intelligence needs to be regulated, specifically on privacy issues. And we need to find some sophisticated way to identify fake photographs, in particular, fake news articles.
What is the status of your class action suit? It's being heard now?
The legal cases in America go on for years.
Not only in America, not only in America. Yeah. But all that. Many years ago, long before ChatGPT, about 20 years ago, another writer plagiarized something of my work. And I was talking to a friend who works in the Bombay film industry about this. And she said, in the Bombay film industry, she was once told, our definition of copyright is the right to copy. There's this question at the back, the lady in the white kurta. No, at the back, yeah. Yeah, the lady in the white kurta there, at the corner, next to Stan, yeah.
Good evening, sir. I just wanted to ask you, so I think one sense is that the nuclear weapons of the last century, they helped as a deterrence, in terms of any major conflicts. But in this century, we've been seeing, these smaller sort of fights. There's been Ukraine, there's been Syria, you have the US bombing Iraq now. How do you view the role of nuclear weapons in this century?
So before I answer that, because I would like Kai to answer that in detail, one of his very important, but perhaps less known books is a major anthology on nuclear weapons, which you edited with Larry Lipschultz, right? So please answer that, Len, because that's a very important question.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very dangerous. Oppenheimer, in that speech that I let you hear 2 minutes of, later on, he says quite explicitly, you may think that these weapons were very expensive because we spent $2 billion on them. But in fact, they're cheap. And you may think that they are weapons for defense. In fact, they are weapons for aggressors, and they are weapons of terror. And they were used in the first instance on an enemy that was virtually already vanquished. And later, in a couple of years later, in 47, he gives a testimony before the Senate, and a senator asks him, well, Dr. Oppenheimer, what is the defense against the possibility that some non-state actors could get a hold of a nuclear device, put it in a suitcase or a crate, and smuggle it aboard a ship into New York Harbor? And Oppenheimer said, oh, yes, well, there's a defense. You could get a screwdriver and open up every suitcase and every wooden crate. You know, he was being sarcastic, and but this exchange actually led the U.S. government to commission a top secret study of the threat of nuclear terrorism by a non-state actor. And it has never been released. It's still classified, but you know, in that world, it's known as the Screwdriver Report. So I think it's, you know, seriously speaking, we've been much too complacent about living with the atomic bomb. And I fear, look at Ukraine and Putin, Putin threatening tactical nuclear weapons. Look at the terrible war in Gaza. You know, there are a lot of angry people out there, and there are a lot of states, you know, North Korea and India and Pakistan, and tomorrow Iran.
And
So-
Israel, above
and-
all Israel. Let's
and
not forget
Israel.
Israel.
Yes, Israel. So I worry, you know, that the story could still end very badly.
At the back there? Yeah. I'll come. You'd love to add stuff. Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to ask, why did you name the book American Prometheus, since Prometheus got a gift to man which was very beneficial in Greek mythology?
Right. Great question. And it leads me to answer by telling a story about my wife, Susan. So when Marty and I were working on the book together over the last 5 years of the 25 years, we both sort of thought that the title should be very simple, Oppie, his nickname. And we loved that title, and Susan hated it, and Marty's wife hated it. And finally, one day, a few days before the book was about to go into production, we get a call from our editor, and she says, you know, the marketing people say they cannot sell a book called Oppie. So you have until, this was on a Friday, you have until Monday to come up with a new title. And that night, as I was falling asleep, Susan said, well, why don't you call it Prometheus or American Prometheus? And I rolled over muttering, you know, who remembers these in this day and age? They're Greek mythical gods. And I rejected the title. And then early the next morning, I get a call from Marty Shewin, very excited, saying, last night I went out to dinner with our old friend Ron Steele, a biographer and historian. And Ron said he would never read a book called Oppie, but why don't you call it American Prometheus?
Wonderful.
So I groaned and I said, oh, Marty, all right, but I'm in big trouble with my wife now.
Wonderful. I think the American is critical there because it is really a story. I mean, it's a story of, if you look at biography as a window into history. Now, your work is obviously a history of science, a history of war, but also a history of, above all, maybe a history of America, 20th century America. So I think it's very good
It's
that
a
you had
good title, but I didn't answer her question.
Yeah.
Why Prometheus? Well, Prometheus stole fire from Zeus, gave it to humanity, and then Zeus punished Prometheus, and hanged him against a giant cliff, and had a giant eagle come every night and peck out his liver and torture him. Well, this is what happened to Oppenheimer. He stole atomic fire as such, gave it to humanity, and then he was 9 years later punished for this.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the insightful talk. I wanted to understand, you said that there were thousands of pages, nearly 50,000 documents that you all had to, go through. How did you all decide what to keep out? What were some of the conflicts between you and Mr. Shewin?
Biography, like any other scholarship, is highly subjective. It's maybe even more subjective than straight history because you're writing about a personal life, and you can't possibly write the whole life. That would be tens of thousands of pages. And so you have to make selections. You have to say, this is what interests me about Oppenheimer's life, and I'm going to include this. So there were 8,000 pages of FBI documents. We cite quite a few of them, quote from them, but most of them are just terribly boring. They're repetitive, salacious, and they're not worth quoting, in my opinion. But, another biographer might come along and find something in there that's why we have multiple biographies of the same figure. It's a very subjective process. It's like writing a novel, except you have to have footnotes for every quotation, every fact.
As someone once said, a biographer is an artist under oath.
I
That's
like
pretty
that
good.
line.
Yeah, that's not like a novelist who can make up,
Yeah, right.
invent dialogue and so on. An artist, but under oath. Yeah.
Yeah.
But some biographers, what they do, Kai, is that they might have a supplement to answer that lady's very important question. A supplementary volume of documents. So at least, in some cases, sometimes they go overboard. For example, when Martin Gilbert went overboard because he wrote 8 volumes on Churchill. And then there were, I think, 25 volumes of documents to go with those. But, just maybe when you're accepting a letter, you're absolutely right, to a life as interesting, as capacious, and touching so many aspects of American and world history as Oppenheimer, you have to be selective. But maybe where you quote one paragraph of a really interesting letter, a supplementary volume of the whole letter, along with something that a report of J. Edgar Hoover. Have you ever thought of that, or would that be for someone else to do?
My publisher would probably walk away in disgust and say, you're dreaming. But, this reminds me of the volume that I did with Larry Lifshultz.
That's it. Yeah.
Hiroshima Shadow. And that's a volume that has a long essay of introduction, but it's mainly a collection of essays and documents, diary items, and it's a very useful text about the decision to use the atomic bomb.
So maybe in Oppenheimer's shadow.
Hi, Kai. So my question is, we've all heard Oppenheimer quote the famous line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I've become death, the destroyer of worlds." So to your understanding, till what extent did Oppenheimer carry his religious values from such scriptures to his actual work in science?
Well, that reminds me that one of his close friends, who am I thinking of? Ezzy, anyway, who was a major physicist, but took his Jewishness seriously, unlike Oppenheimer. And he famously said one day, Oppenheimer would have been a better physicist if he had read less of the Gita and more of the Talmud.
Do you agree?
Well, no, I don't have an opinion about that. I think, but it's clear that Oppenheimer loved reading the Gita, and it resonated with him in some fashion. And I think the line, I am death, destroyer of worlds, that's not what he said at the Trinity test. At the Trinity test, he turned to Frank, or Frank turned to him and said, well, it worked. And then a few days later, Oppenheimer is being interviewed by Lawrence, the New York Times reporter who was assigned to write a sort of authorized reporting story about the building of the bomb that would be published after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So he interviews Oppenheimer and he asks him, well, what, sir, went through your head when you saw that tremendous explosion? And that's when Oppenheimer pulled out the quote from the Gita. And I've been told, I don't know, I'd be interested, Ram, in your opinion. I've been told that the correct English translation of that line would be, I am time, destroyer of worlds.
Maybe there's a Sanskrit scholar here. Okay. Yeah. There. Yeah.
Oh,
There.
s-
Yeah. There.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask whether Oppenheimer and the other scientists were they consulted for the actual use of the weapon, or was it always pre-decided that once the bomb was ready, it would be dropped?
Yeah, no, both in the book and in the film, you see Oppenheimer in a meeting back in Washington with Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and they're debating about the targets. And, you know, they had been firebombing all these Japanese cities all spring and early summer, destroying much of Tokyo, but they kept 5 cities in Japan pristine as virgin targets, literally, to be used in the event that the atomic bomb came along. They wanted to show what the destructive power and not have it corrupted by firebombing devastation before. And Oppenheimer participates in that meeting, and there is a petition circulating by Leo Szilard at the time, which Oppenheimer refuses to sign, suggesting that there should be a demonstration on an uninhabited island. And Oppenheimer, you know, he convinced himself as early as the spring of '45, when a meeting was convened among his own physicists at Los Alamos to discuss the future of the gadget and civilization. That was the title of the talk. And there was a vigorous debate. You know, they were asking, why are we working so hard to build this evil weapon when Hitler is dead? And we know the Japanese don't have the capability of doing this. So why are we doing this? And Oppenheimer let them debate. And then very characteristically, he then stepped forward from the back of the room and said, well, gentlemen, I want to remind you that of what Niels Bohr asked me on the last day of 1943 when he arrived in Los Alamos, having escaped from Denmark. And Bohr said, you know, Robert, I have one question for you. Is it big enough? Is the gadget big enough to end all war? And he proceeded to make an argument that, you know, humanity would not understand the terribleness of this weapon if it was simply demonstrated on an uninhabited island. And therefore, the next war would be fought by 1 or 2 or 3 armed adversaries armed with nuclear weapons, and it would be Armageddon. So he was making a really deeply Faustian bargain, you know, saying, we will do this, we will kill all these people, and then people will understand why we can never have total warfare again, and we must contain this weapon. I'm not convinced by that. It's a rationalization in part, but that's what he convinced himself of.
But some military historians have also argued, I mean, I don't understand military history pretty well, that because the Japanese was so committed to defending, that if there had been a land invasion, maybe they estimate 1 million Americans would have died and so on. I mean, are those credible?
Okay, no. Well, but when I say that, it's very controversial. It's hotly debated by historians in America today. But Marty and I were, in fact, this is one of our major motivations for writing this book. We were convinced that all the evidence shows that the Japanese were on the verge of surrendering in the summer of 1945. The earliest schedule for the major invasion of the Japanese home islands wasn't until November 1st, and really by the end of the year. And we knew this, the strongest evidence is that we were intercepting and translating Japanese diplomatic cable traffic. So in June of 1945, Harry Truman, the president, the new accidental president, noted in his handwritten diary, which was not discovered until the 70s, he noted there, received a cable from the Jap emperor today asking for peace. What he's referring to is he was given a translation of one of the intercepted cables, and it's a cable from the Japanese Emperor Hirohito to his ambassador in Moscow saying, the war is over, we must surrender, but we must obtain from the Americans promise that they will not touch the institution of the emperorship and they won't put me on trial as a war criminal. And of course, we did that even after 2 bombs. So Marty and I believe that the bombs were essentially unnecessary. And as you heard, I said earlier, Oppenheimer himself came to believe that was true. And this line is in the movie where he turns to Edward Teller and says, well, you know, Edward, I just came back from Washington and the intelligence briefings, and I learned that we essentially dropped this weapon on an already defeated enemy. So, but this is still a hotly controversial. Most Americans think, oh, the bomb saved 1 million American lives. But there's nothing in the archives to show such an estimate. But this is how, you know, history is made and is mythologized.
Yeah.
Hi, Kai. I have 2 short questions.
One question, please.
Sorry. So, the film's allusion to the fact that Oppenheimer thought that CIA was behind Jean Tatlock's murder. Is there any evidence to that?
Not the CIA. The CIA didn't exist in 1944 when she died. But in the book, we spend a lot of words trying to explain what happened to Jean Tatlock. She was depressed. She was a medical doctor studying to become a psychiatrist. And she was discovered slumped over a bathtub, having drowned herself. Now, that's a very difficult way to commit suicide. You know, your natural inflection is to draw back from the bathtub. But, and unfortunately, there is evidence that Boris Pash, who is the head of Army counterintelligence, had it in for Oppenheimer, knew that Oppenheimer had been seeing Tatlock, knew that Tatlock was a communist, and therefore, in his world, this was evidence of maybe betrayal. And so the suggestion is that maybe Pash had her offed. But, you know, there was a suicide note. It wasn't signed. There were barbiturates and alcohol in her bloodstream. Maybe she tried really hard to drown herself in a bathtub. But in a book, you know, you can present all that nuanced evidence carefully and let the reader decide. In the movie, they actually does that too. He portrays her committing suicide with pills and alcohol, and then as there are 2 scenes where she's thrusting her head into the bathtub, and then there's another scene where you see her head going in, but there's black gloves pushing her in. So Nolan is letting the viewer decide what happened.
There's a very, in the book, there's a very moving description of her father entering through the window and going through the possessions and burning the letters. It's very, and one does not know what the letters and documents contain, but it's a very vivid and very moving description.
Very moving, yeah. Well, we think that what he was destroying was love letters and evidence that Jean was bisexual or.
Okay, yeah, which you talk about,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. So, how did Tatlock's death affect Oppenheimer's work?
I think he was devastated by her death. He felt responsible in some ways. He clearly still had affection for Tatlock. But, he was conflicted. He was married to Kitty. Kitty was this very vivacious, strong-willed woman who was very much in his life and would be until the day he died, 20 years. So he was conflicted about it. Did it affect his work? I don't think so. He was obsessed to make the Trinity test successful. And
Yeah, yeah. You had a question, and then another question, and then back there. Yeah. Okay.
Hello. Hi, Kai. So my question was, it is quite evident that from history that Oppenheimer kind of, in a way, started the nuclear arms race, which continued for decades after.
Well, he was not alone in that whole project, so don't say Oppenheimer.
No, yeah.
So correct, please.
In a way.
Anyway,
Yes.
let's
So
not demonize in that way. Go ahead.
yes,
go
yes. No, I'm not demonizing.
ahead. Go
So
ahead.
my question is actually currently and in history, the entire nuclear community, whether it be diplomats, bureaucrats, or scientists, or even the disarmament community, the experts, how do they view Oppenheimer in today's context, or across decades, how have they viewed him? If you have interacted with them during your research or anything, so what opinions have you got?
you mean how they view him today?
Yes.
Well, I think the only way I can answer that is that, after the book came out, Marty and I became a little obsessed about the notion that maybe we could persuade the Obama administration to issue an executive order nullifying the 1954 decision, arguing that what happened there was a violation of the Atomic Energy Commission's own rules. And we got a lot of pushback. We said, the Secretary of Energy, who was himself a physicist, told us that no, his lawyers in the Energy Department say we can't do this because it would set a precedent. It might create a double standard in the security system. We were very frustrated, but we persisted over a period of 12 years. And finally, in December 22, we got the Energy Department Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, to issue an order nullifying the decision. And I had a meeting with her. She was persuaded, she told me, by reading the book. And her lawyers also found a way to do it. And it's an important thing to do because we don't want this lingering suspicion of disloyalty and such to hang over Oppenheimer. We want current civil servants to understand that they can dissent against policy and there won't be a retribution. That is as equally important as any maintaining the inviolability of the security system.
But the question that the young man asked, that the disarmament community today possibly sees Oppenheimer as a hero, as someone who helped, oversee the building of the bomb and then kind of recanted, and so it's horrible implications.
Well, he never recanted, but I think they do look upon him as a hero because he turned 180 degrees in the fall of 1945 and spent the rest of his life trying to construct a legal system with scientists involved and lawyers to ban the bomb and make it impossible for anyone to rely on these weapons as military weapons. So he's regarded as, a hero in that sense, but with a hero with a dubious background.
Yeah. Good. I think.
Hello.
Sorry, I think someone there was before that.
No,
Yeah.
I was holding the mic for.
Oh.
Yeah. Thanks. Sorry. A simple question. You mentioned that you gave 2 suggestions to Nolan to improve in the movie, in the script. What were the ones which he didn't accept, which you gave?
Oh, I only had 2 suggestions for him, and one was he had in the initial script a scene where Oppenheimer is being asked, Dr. Oppenheimer, how many people died as a result of what you did? And his answer was 75,000. And I pointed out to Christopher that that was a low number. And as I did, he interrupted me and said, yes, yes, I know that's a low number. Most historians use at least double that for the two cities and over 250,000 for after 6 months. And I'm trying to find a way to fix it. But I found that 75, that's the answer that Oppenheimer gave in the security hearing. So that was sort of impressive. You know, again, Nolan was paying attention to the detail.
Yeah.
And in the final film, he fixed it by having Oppenheimer, played by Cillian Murphy, saying 75,000 and then hesitating and saying, well, 140,000 for the two cities and maybe much more over time. So, you know, that was good. He also, I suggested that it might be important to somehow include this line about that he gave in this 1945 November speech in Philadelphia, where he says that we use this weapon on an essentially already defeated enemy. And he accepted that to my, you know, I was impressed by that. He used it, he had Cillian Murphy say this to the Edward Teller actor, but yeah.
Hello, Kai. It's been a pleasure listening to you. My question, in your journey into writing about these personalities, how do you retain the truth and rather the struggles in maintaining the essence of these personalities? And by extension, do these stories have an impact on your personal life?
Well, you know, as the biographer, we're trying to create a whole human being with any of the characters that we're writing about. But Oppenheimer was particularly difficult because, you know, he's such an iconic figure. And that picture on the cover of the book of the American edition, not the Indian or British edition, is a photograph of Oppenheimer staring straight into the camera and dangling a cigarette from his lips and wearing his pork pie hat and just staring really intently, almost accusingly at the photographer, who is Alfred Eisenstadt.
Okay. All right.
And I chose, you know, I found that photo during my interview with Ann Wilson, the woman who told me the story about those poor little people. At the end of the interview, she went to her bookshelf and pulled out this photo book of Alfred Eisenstadt photos and turned to the portrait of Oppenheimer. And I just looked at that and I said, that's the cover, because it captures the intensity of Oppenheimer's personality and his ability to be theatrical. You know, he had an enormous ego, and he played on it. He played on his celebrity as father of the atomic bomb to gain access to Washington. And this is one of the reasons why in 1954, he subjected himself to the hearing. He didn't have to do that. He could have just walked away and his security clearance was about to expire. But he wanted, you know, he enjoyed that access. It was an ego thing.
But his even as a young man, as young, brilliant young scientist in the film, they depict that well, his theatricality, you know, in teaching at Berkeley and these seminars in Europe and so on. That comes out.
That comes out, yeah.
Yeah, it comes out nicely. Yeah.
Hello, Kai. I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm halfway through the American Prometheus. Needless to say, I've read the Oppenheimer screenplay twice. Now I got to know that you have been dealing your whole life with a lot of very ambiguous and paradoxical people. So, is it safe to say that when we go deeper into anything, uh, anything complex like a human life, because you're a person who's dealing with people's life, is it safe to say that when we go deeper into it, everything gets ambivalent, ambiguous, and highly paradoxical, including the quantum world? And
Well, ambiguity is good. You know, you don't want a cardboard figure in a biography. You want to show each of us are very complex human beings. We have good thoughts and nasty thoughts and good behavior and unseemly behavior. We're complicated, and uh, we're we're creatures of our community, but also any human being is, I would argue, is vulnerable, is fragile. And Oppenheimer, his story shows this 10 times over. I mean, he's really, he's brilliant and he's got this big ego, but he's extremely fragile. And this, I think, we've been over backwards to keep that material in the book because we wanted to show his humanity, his vulnerabilities. So nuance and ambiguity is a good thing. It may be frustrating if you want a black and white story, but no good story is black and white.
Hello, Kai. Both Levi Strauss and Oppenheimer were both Jews. And you do mention in the book how their Jewish upbringing is very different from each other. But given the persecution of Jews in the Second World War, how did they both find themselves on the opposite sides during the McCarthy era?
Yes, the relationship between Strauss and Oppenheimer was fraught with misunderstanding and bad chemistry. They were just completely opposite personalities, Oppenheimer was this really well-read polymath of an intellectual. Louis Strauss only graduated from high school. He was a self-made man who started out selling shoes. He, was very ambitious and competent and clawed his way up into the national security apparatus during World War II. And he thought of himself as an equal to Oppenheimer, which is a big mistake. Because Oppenheimer had a tendency, he had a character flaw, I would argue, in that he could be very gentle and sweet and kind and patient with his students or strangers in the street who he encountered. But if he was in the presence of an authority figure, someone who presumed to be on his level, he was quick to be snide and dismissive and rude. And he was rude on repeated occasions to Louis Strauss and made an enemy of him. And this is a pattern, Oppenheimer made an enemy of Harry Truman by telling Truman, "I have blood on my hands." So he's complicated, but Strauss had it eventually, he hired Oppenheimer to be director at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, but he grew to dislike him intensely and became convinced that he was a security threat and maybe a spy. And so he orchestrated this terrible security hearing that turned into a kangaroo court.
When you're talking about Truman, there's again a vivid description in your book about Truman saying, "Here's a handkerchief and wipe the blood off your hands." Right? It's very, 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 very nice. Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, I haven't seen the film or read your book, but when you refer to the poisoned apple, I assume it's a kind of psychological fragility or vulnerability. How far did his Jewishness affect him psychologically, this vulnerability?
Yes. Okay. He was of Jewish ancestry. His father was a German immigrant. His mother was born in Baltimore, of Jewish German ancestry. But he was raised in New York City in ethical culture school, which is sort of a secular religion, no gods, but they had a school where they taught students to study ethical dilemmas and how to act ethically in society. And, they had sort of Sunday meetings where they would have speakers. It came out of Reform Judaism, but it was not Judaism. And most Jews regard it even to this day as a heretical offshoot, but it still exists. And this underscored another of the differences between Strauss and Oppenheimer. Strauss took his Jewishness very seriously. He attended a conservative temple, and he couldn't understand why Oppenheimer, seemed to be in denial about his Jewishness.
So I'm sorry we've run right out of time. I just wanted to close by thanking Kai, not just for his wonderful book and his wonderful talk, but for making the effort to come here. He's flown here from Jaipur, and Susan and he are flying to Kathmandu tomorrow because they have a long association with Nepal. And it's been a great privilege to have had him at the Bangalore International Center. Let me try and do the maths. It's 55 years since he came here last, but we'll make sure that he'll come back here sooner. So, and he'll be signing books outside as soon as all of you go out. So thank you all for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you, Ram.